TitansLeague coming to you today, bringing you another video. And today I want to speak about optimizing the Sting. The Sting is a weapon that I hold very dear and close to my heart because it's something that I really enjoy using. However, due to its frequent missing and low DPS, I don't really see myself using it in a competitive setting. But hopefully today I'll be able to shine some light on how to use it in a competitive setting and how to optimize it for its best use in order to have it become more usable and hopefully less obsolete in the future. So without further ado, let's just nail down a couple things before we move on to the video. The Sting is a currently operating principle is known as a homing missile type. Its hard course is a light and its damage type is heat. Now the Sting's max range is 400 meters and the Sting's optimal range is a 300 meter span. Now before we continue into the analysis part of the video, I just want to say please look for a small screen, maybe it might even be half the screen, but look for a screen in which it just says TitansLeague, a black screen. That will be the screen that I'll be using for assisting myself in this video in drawing diagrams and pretty much giving you an illustration of what I'm talking about that I can't exactly explain in words in the best way, so it'll help you better understand what exactly we're doing and help you follow along with the process of the video. I hope you guys enjoy. Please remember to subscribe and like if you did. This video did take a lot of work, so give it a thumbs up if you can. If you didn't like it, I always appreciate some constructive criticism, of course, but please do like it if you did, because it did take a while. So without further ado, let's speak about the Sting. So one nuance that I want to speak about before I even begin covering anything else as in the modules is that the aim nuance of the Sting. So the Sting has this very specific thing that I noticed that works very well with it, is that once you get into 300 meter range with the Sting, it really doesn't work in terms of locking onto a target and aiming at them. Now that may be due to the fact that the game doesn't really have too many great aiming and lock-on modules right now. But who knows? All I know is that right now, when something gets under 300 meters, you cannot hit it very well with the missiles that come from the Sting. But something that I discovered from my own personal experience, and is crunching some numbers in mathematics, is that with the Sting, there is a trajectory that you can use in order to help you hit objects that is under 300 meters and effectively do damage to them every single time. That trajectory does require one or two considerations which we'll discuss. So please look at the screen, and we're going to be moving on to a page that I want to begin with in terms of the trajectory. So of course, yes, we are optimizing the Sting, and this is TitansLeague speaking. So to begin, if we were on a mountain and the enemy was on the bottom of the mountain, something that I've noticed about the Sting is that if you exploit its trajectory that it shoots at, you can actually hit objects below 300 meters if you are elevated or if you are de-elevated below and above the enemy that you're trying to hit. Essentially, you're exploiting that parabolic shape that those missiles create whenever they shoot out of the Sting. Now, one of the problems with this might be, well, doesn't the Sting's parabola, doesn't the parabola of the missiles, doesn't the trajectory of the missiles change every time you shoot it? Well, to tell you the truth, not really. The reason why is because the programmers actually programmed into the Sting that the missiles are supposed to follow a strict parabolic shape, unlike weapons like the Javelin and others along those lines. Meaning that most of the time, the parabola of your Sting will be optimized to follow a very strict boundaries in which has already been set by the game. But you can, again, exploit that by using elevation in your hands. The way in which you can do that is simple. If you were on a mountain and you were in a Nelly with 4 Stings on it, just for the case of discussion, this is you as the little dot on top of the mountain, enemies down here. You could simply just launch your missiles at an elevation close to the trajectory of your Sting. It doesn't even have to be extremely close because the missiles adapt to your actual elevation to hit your target. So they do lock on, meaning that they will adapt to the parabola of your elevation. But if you actually hit them from the top of the mountain, you will actually be able to hit them accurately and do a lot more damage than if you were below 300 meters and you tried to hit them on a flat surface, in which case the missiles would come into a problem, which we'll discuss later on in this video. Similarly, if you were at the bottom of a mountain, which this diagram is not the drawing of that, but Likewise, it works vice versa. Going back to the original drawing, if you were where the enemy was and the enemy was where you were, if you were to shoot up, now again, this is for the sake of an argument, we're not assuming that this really is the actual measurement of, 240 degrees, because I don't know if things can shoot up that kind of incline, but this is just for the sake of an argument, in which case we will say that this parabola would meet the arch of the missiles, in which case you'd be able to hit a target under 300 meters. The next picture again, even if the enemy was under some kind of obstruction and you were on top of it, if you shot off your missiles at a trajectory similar to the trajectory of your elevation, you can actually be able to hit it very accurately. Now the question is, well, big deal, the missiles are supposed to do this. Well, to give you the honest truth, this is giving you a way to exploit the fact that under 200 and 300 meters you cannot really hit anything, because everything really just goes over the head of your enemies. For example, in this case, if we looked at the first picture up here, which I am titling number 1, if you were this pink dot right there and you were to shoot at this enemy bot, which is this block here, this is a Tirpitz, okay, and you are in a Nelly just for the sake of an argument. With the Nelly is really just a low down and a low elevated bot, so you could hit your target at less than 300 meters and be somewhat successful, because as you know, the tip of your parabola, the height of your parabola, would actually catch the Tirpitz and hit it, just because of the Tirpitz sheer size in comparison to your elevation and in comparison to the set parabolic shape that the missiles will be making when you shoot them. So that's good. That's out of the question. You can hit a Tirpitz under 300 meters with the Sting. But that's not the problem, because how many times does a Nelly with Stings face off against a Tirpitz? Well, I don't know how often that happens, and I wouldn't suggest doing that. But here's where the problem comes into play. Since the Sting is really a weapon you have to kind of stay back in medium range of the battlefield and play support or ambusher type, you are a lot of times are going to have the threat of being bombarded by faster bots like the Little Sean and the Mite, in which case you're going to have to figure out a way to navigate around their really close protocol fighting, in which case this is where most likely the Sting becomes most obviously unusable in the case of close distance fightings. It's when you have a bot, an enemy bot, that is not necessarily smaller than you, but an enemy bot that is similar in stature, unlike the Tirpitz, in which case your elevations are on similar levels. And if they get close enough under 300 meters, those Stings will not work at effective range. Therefore, majority of the time, those Stings will shoot you missiles. The missiles will shoot over the Mite or Little Sean's head, thus allowing them to sneak in and then taking you out, totally game over. However, there is an exception, in which case you can also artificially elevate yourself, as I had shown you previously. Elevation is a key in close distance fightings with the Sting. Well, now you could artificially create that elevation by, of course, if you were in a Nelly or if you were in a Mite. Unfortunately, it's not going to work for a Ravager or a Little Sean. Well, Little Sean can jump, but it's not going to work for a Ravager. You can artificially create that elevation, and upon the highest peak of your jump, you would fire off your missiles, and you would be less than 300 close range, and your missiles would most likely hit your target, thus dealing damage to them and rendering them unusable and getting them out of your way. However, in the worst case scenario, which most likely is what happened, you're not paying attention, you're out on the battlefield, you're trying to support everyone else, you're behind an aircraft, and all of a sudden one stupid Little Sean or Little Mite comes up. You know how they always do, they sneak around behind and they paralyze you. Shoot, you cannot artificially create height to match up your parabolic shape and exploit it in order to hit the enemy. So what do you do at this point? Well, unfortunately, there really is nothing to do at this point, in which case the enemy attacks you, and even when you shoot, all of your missiles go overhead, thus rendering you defeated and rendering your bot totally useless and therefore dead. So this is why I wanted to talk about the Sting, because it really is a tactical weapon that makes you think about how to use it. It's not something you just shoot and you spray and you fire and you get the kill. It's something you really have to look forward to using, and if you use it properly and if you use it intelligently, like these selected ways here, 1 and 2, you can really do some damage. But if you do not understand what you're doing and you use it in ways like 3 over here, you will absolutely fail. But unfortunately, the circumstance is not always optimal like 1 and 2, and you will meet circumstances where you're going to have to deal with circumstance number 3. So be prepared. Extra weapon armor, that's when that comes into play. It throws people off, so forth and so on. So the next discussion, after we got that out of the case, that nuance of aiming with the Sting, I want to get into the actual meat of this video, which is seeing how we can optimize the modules of the Sting in order to create a most damaging and effectuating Sting on the battlefield, to have the Sting working at the level equivocal of other weapons like the Tormentor and the Mangler. If any case, the Sting can actually work side by side of the Mangler and do times, which I will release that in another video showing the similarities and differences between these two weapons. However, it's important to note in the video these amounts right here, because I will be referring to them and I will be using them, so please take a screenshot, take a picture, and note these amounts, because in the subsequent calculations I will be talking about them, and I think you'd like to know it so you can follow along with my calculations. Okay, so it isn't very difficult. It's actually pretty simple how we're going to do this. So for the sake of this discussion, we are going to abbreviate magazine as being M. As being M. And we're going to abbreviate feeding gear as being F, and weapon armor as being ARM, which I won't really be referring to that, so you don't really need to know that, but just for future reference, ARM, and reinforced ammunition will be referred to as just plain old R. I also want to say that in this video, I'm not going to be mixing modules on weapons. I'm not going to be creating hybrids like magazine plus reinforced armor plus feeders, or whatever the case is, just because for the sake of discussion and analysis in theory, I believe that really the best outfitters you can have, or the most high DPS weapon you will be able to create, is a weapon with all of the same modules equipped on it. That is just based off of the map that I've done. It makes sense. Now, if you want to look at other tactics and other strategies, I would suggest creating a hybrid. But if you want to look purely at DPS, sticking with a lot of the same homogeneous modules will give you the best DPS as an end result. So getting this video moving right along, let's go along to our calculations. It is very simple math. So the first thing we're going to calculate in order to make our comparisons is we're going to calculate the damage that a T3 reinforced ammunition bullet does. Now, I want to make this clear is that for the sake of this video and the sake of time, I'm only going to be doing this analysis or even doing the calculations on T3 modules and the T3 Sting. However, at the end of the video, I will have various graphs and data tables with information about T2 weapons and T2 modules ready and available for you to see, because I know they're expensive, so not everyone has really T3s. But the reason why we're using T3s is just because it's something that everyone's working up to, so eventually you will have to come across these modules and weapon upgrades, so we might as well talk about them right now. So with the T3 reinforced times 4 on your 1 Nelly Sting, the base damage we know is 140. Well, let me write a red here so you can see that better. The base damage is 140 DPS. Not DPS, but just 140 damage per one of these bullets. Also, the base magazine, as you saw, was 6 over here, which I underlined. So what we're going to be doing is we're just simply going to be adding the base damage plus 4 times the damage for each T3 reinforced ammunition module, which is 29 damage, times 4 for 4 modules, plus the base damage that the weapon comes with at T3, and that will give us a grand total of doing 1,536 damage per 10 seconds. However, for the sake of being able to compare these amounts, because they'll each have different damage per increment of times, I'm going to split it up into DPS by taking this amount and dividing it by the 10 seconds, which is fairly understandable. Now, it's important to understand that, again, this is an average DPS, because if you think about it, you have to wait 10 seconds for the weapon to reload, and then you can do this damage within about a second or any minute time, which we won't mention because it's really inconsequential the amount of time it takes to unrack those missiles and do that damage. But it's important to note that for the sake of this discussion, this is an average damage per second, not an exact damage per second. Moving on to the next calculation. So the next calculation, we're going to be looking at T3 feeders, which is something that a lot of people I find ignore, especially for a lot of weapons, which is interesting. So this is really why I want to do these videos, because I've always suggested that T3 feeders have something to do with them, some nuance that developers put on there that we're not exactly seeing. They just don't really look attractive from the beginning, just at their core values. But when you look at it, you might see something different. I've used T3 reinforced, I've used T3 magazines, and I've never used T3 feeders. I've never had full T3 feeders, so I wanted to do it in theory and see what we would get from it. And here's what I got, was that we have to first, the feeders effectuate reload speed. So we're going to have to start doing this calculation from the area of reload. So the base reload is 10 seconds. While with the T3 feeder modules on it, each one is minus 1.2 seconds. You multiply that by 4 for how many we're going to have, and you subtract that or add that to 10, and that gives you a 5.2 second reload rate on your magazine. Now that is almost half of the 10 base reload rate that you have. So keep that in mind and keep these ratios in mind that we're talking about. So then next, now that we know how long it'll take it to reload, we want to actually calculate the damage, because that's what this video is about. Multiply 140 the base times 6, which equals 840 damage. Now here's where this amount comes into play. We know now that 840 damage is done every 5.2 seconds. So when you look at that, that is a little bit different from what we said before. Because if you look at our reinforced ammo, it does a whole lot more. It does almost double the amount. But double the amount in almost double the time. The reinforced ammo does a little bit more, less than double the amount in a little bit more than double the time. So keep that in mind. So then we calculate the DPS, and here's where you see where that comes into play. So at face value, this is why it's important to understand how your weapons really work, because at face value, you would suggest that T3 reinforced ammunition does more damage, but in reality, when you look at the feeders do, even though it's a little bit less, the feeders still do 10 more DPS per second than your T3 reinforced, which kind of just blows your mind, because you think that the reinforced are supposed to really do the most amount of damage, when really even T3 feeders do way more than that. So that's why I wonder why people neglect it, because in reality T3 feeders have some pack for what you're paying for, and they can deal out, even though it's only 10 more damage per second, when you're looking at a 10-minute game and 10 damage and 10 more damages every second, that adds up to even more than 1,000 over the game, even if you're not even shooting more, even if you're not shooting every instant of the game. So keep that in mind. Lastly, we're going to be looking at simply our T3 magazine. One of the most thought about and suggested things is the T3 magazine, because a lot of weapons right now currently in the game use T3 magazines. A lot of people, not weapons, sorry, a lot of people, including myself, outfitted their weapons with T3 magazines because we assume that the magazines really do more damage, which is something that I made the mistake of when I first started using the Sting. If you're watching my video right now along with this, you would also see that the BoT that I'm most likely using is my T3 Nelly, my Nelly with T3 Stings on them with magazines on it. And with the magazines, as you can see, it doesn't really pack that much punch, but we'll get into why it doesn't pack that much punch for what I'm paying for. So first, do the calculation. Of course, likewise again, we're doing 3 times 4 because now we're multiplying the amount of added ammo with the T3 magazines to the amount of magazines that we're having, T3 magazines that we're having, plus the base amount of ammo, which is 6. So this is way more than doubling the ammo. This is actually 3 times the original ammo that we're having when you equip T3 magazines on there with 18 ammo. Now we multiply that ammo by the amount of damage that one of those missiles do, and what do we get? Well, we get a grand whopping amount of 2,520 damage. Now that looks like a whole crap ton compared to our once before 1,840 and 1,536. So automatically you'd now say, well, guess what? T3 magazines must totally win out. But no, because here's what happens. That is 2,520 damage in 15.2 seconds. almost 3 times our feeder gear, and twice as much, well, almost twice as much as reinforced ammo, because every bullet that you add, every magazine you add, you're adding plus 1.3 seconds, which will give you roughly about a 15.2 reload weight, or in other words, a grand total of 165.7 DPS. Now people say, wait, hold a minute, let's look at every other DPS. We have for T3 reinforced ammo, 153 DPS. We have for T3 feeders, 161.53 DPS. And then we have for T3 magazines, we have for T3 magazines 165.7 DPS, which means that essentially this is doing much more, well, not much more damage, but about 4 an estimate 3 more damage, or DPS, than our T3 feeders, which makes our T3 magazine wins. Well, game over. Everyone says, well, that's up. I knew it. I was right. TitansLeague was wrong. He's stupid. He doesn't know what he's talking about. T3 magazines on your T3 stings will do the most amount of damage per second. Even if it's 10 more, big deal. What does that matter? Well, here's the fact. Because from using this, I've discovered one more thing which I want to discuss, which is the fact of this. Think quantitatively, analyze quantitatively, but then you have to look at it qualitatively. This is the facts. For our reinforced, we have 153 DPS, our feeder 161, and our magazine 165. It looks like the magazine wins, but the reason why it doesn't is because when we really analyze what's going on, if you've really been paying attention, I know it's hard to pay attention to two things at once, but if you've really been paying attention to my gameplay, which you can look back and watch some pieces of it if you missed it, a lot of my hits with my Nelly, with T3 magazines, don't exactly hit the enemy bot. I should be doing anywhere, if you took my magazine, which, let's see, what was that value? That value was a grand total of, I had it here somewhere, give me one moment, a grand total of 2,500 damage per one sting. If you took that and multiplied that by 4, because I'm using a Nelly, that should be doing anywhere, I would say roughly about 10,000 plus damage on one hit. Holy crap. Because you know that if you're doing 10,000 plus damage on one hit, that is definitely going to almost get rid of the core of a Tirpitz immediately. 10,000 damage. Tirpitz has a core, I believe, at T3 of a little bit over 10k or 10 HP health. And you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think that's what it is, 10,000 HP. So if you manage to hit him with a full blast of T3 magazines on a T3 sting, you would say, well, I just killed a Tirpitz in one hit. This weapon has to be overpowered. But then why is the case that people are not using it? Well, it's simple. Because in other words, this is the problem I found mostly with the sting with magazines on it. When you are using magazines in your sting, you have a lot of ammo to go through. Not only are you going through a lot more ammo than you're usually going through, but you're going through 3 times as much, which means that your shooting's time will take 3 times as long. Something to consider that you didn't see me consider in my calculations, which I hope you saw, was that I never considered how much time it really would take to shoot, plus how much time it will take to reload. That's why. The reason why is because the time that it would take to shoot, I would count it as negligible. But in the case of the magazines, with so much more, as in 3 times as much more shooting time, the reinforced ammunition, the feeder gear are the same amount of shooting time because it's the same amount of bullets you're shooting, missiles you're shooting, but the T3 magazine, you're shooting 3 times as many, which equals a 3 times longer shooting time, which in other words, you're most likely shooting at a grand total of, you're most likely doing your damage at a grand total of 2,520 damage, not in 15.2 seconds, but if anything, in 16 to 17 seconds, which is a whopping almost double the lowest, which is feeding gear. Well, not almost double, actually almost triple, if not triple, the feeding gear time it takes to shoot feeding gear bullets. That means by the time I fire off one full round of using my magazines, the enemy would have already fired at me 3 times with feeding gears on their Nelly, rendering my shots almost too widely spaced apart and useless in the gameplay. The second reason why the T3 magazine it's not cranked up to all what it's said to be is because with so many missiles, you run the risk of missing the shots. Because with the stress being on the sense that in order to do that much damage, in order to do that 2,500 damage, you must hit with all those missiles. And with the more missiles, gives you more chances to miss your enemies. Because as we know, with the Sting missiles moving so slow, you can see it coming from a mile away. Therefore, you jump and half the bullets don't hit, so you have more opportunity to miss your enemy. And with longer waiting times to shoot and your ammo not doing that much damage, every bullet that you have counts towards damage, and you need those bullets to hit. So when those two things are added up in terms of waiting time and you missing most of your hits because of the accuracy, because let's think about it this way, if I look back at the original analysis of my trajectory of shots, most of your shots with the Sting usually do miss, unfortunately, just because of the terrain of the maps. But if you find a way to exploit that, you can't hit your enemies. But even then, a lot of your shots sometimes are a little bit too low, a little bit too high, and go right over. So in this case, with my final remarks, I would say to go with the second best in DPS, or really the best in DPS, which is feeder gears for the win. That being number one, because the feeder gears are more... The feeder gears allow more opportunities to fire and less opportunities to miss, because with the feeding gear, unlike the reinforced ammunition where your stress is on your bullets hitting because each bullet just does that much more damage, or even with your magazine if you're stressed on the amount of bullets hitting because you need every bullet to hit in order to count, missile, with the feeding gears, because you have such little lead time between your shots and your reloads, you can do damage so constantly that you don't run the risk of having your bot being destroyed, especially sitting back at 300 and 400 meters, that if you put yourself in a bad circumstance, not only do you not run the risk of being a big deal whenever you miss shots, because your next shot will be ready in 5.2 seconds, if not sooner. So with that being the number one, the number two is that missing, as I said before, is not very harmful, or it's not very impending, it's not an impending problem to your DPS. With the fact that you have such a great fire rate on your Sting, you can overcome the sense of missing and then that destroying your whole entire setup for your Nelly with Stings or your bot with a Sting. And the last thing I just want to say is that it just does more damage. When you look at it in DPS, although the DPS for the magazine came out to be more, as I said, I never factored it in the sense that really this amount for reload speed should really be plus or minus 2 seconds, because if you add in the time that takes to unhinge and shoot off those extra missiles, that will add up to giving you less than that 10 DPS that magazine gained on feeder gear, which is at 161. In the end, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it was really insightful to helping you optimize the Sting, and I hope that at the end you understand that the Sting is really a great weapon. I hope you learn to enjoy it and use it maybe once, maybe twice. You may not use it competitively, but at least try it out, because I think this Sting is a great weapon. I hope you learn to like it, and I hope this video really helped with learning how to use the Sting. The Sting is an excellent weapon, as I said. It's a very unique weapon, and I think that if you use it in the ways that I described in this video, that the Sting can truly be proved to be useful on the battlefield. And not only that, but it can prove to probably be one of the most terrifying things when your enemy launches, or when you launch a plethora of missiles right into the face of that sorry looking enemy. Have a great day, guys. I hope you enjoyed this. Please leave a like and subscribe, as I said. TitansLeague out, and I will see you on the battlefield in a Nelly with some Stings. See you later.